Welcome to today's webinar. If your ship hasn't come in, build an ark. Preparing a competitive EPA Brownfield grant application. As always, we're excited to have you all here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us. Today, we'll help you navigate the murky depths of EPA Brownfield ARC grants with our grant experts, or should I say grant captains, as well as provide information on how Sustainable Jersey can work in tandem with EPA Brownfield grants by providing additional funding opportunities. For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Fatima Matos, and I'm the events coordinator here at NJIT's Center for Community Systems. Mimi Marcus, our manager for marketing and engagement, and I will be helping to facilitate today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce our experts, should I say captains, for today. Our first speaker, Samantha McGraw, joins us from Sustainable Jersey. Here she manages the daily operations, including the municipal and school certification programs, websites, communications, outreach, training, and events. She supports New Jersey municipalities participating in Sustainable Jersey as they work towards certification and serves as staff support to the Waste Management Task Force. Samantha holds a BS in meteorology from Millersville University, a master's in political science from Colorado State University, and interned with the City of Fort Collins, Colorado Environmental Services Department. She'll be speaking on how Sustainable Jersey can provide additional support and funding for your Brownfield project through its Actions program. Next, NJIT TAB's Brownfield Redevelopment Specialist, Joe Reiner, will speak about EPA Brownfield grants, the different types available and what's available for FY25, as well as how Sustainable Jersey's Actions program can intertwine with tasks you may already be doing for your EPA Brownfield grant application. Joe utilizes his training as an environmental scientist to assist communities in developing specific strategies to overcome their brownfield challenges. His responsibilities include interpreting technical reports and regulatory guidance in a straightforward manner that ensures stakeholders are equipped with the tools and know-how to successfully remediate and redevelop their brownfield sites. He holds a BS in environmental sciences with an ecology minor. Finally, to bring it all home, Elise Muller, NJIT TAB's Brownfield Redevelopment Specialist, will go over some tips, tricks, and common pitfalls to avoid when crafting your EPA Brownfield application. With a background in due diligence and environmental consulting, Elise assists communities in understanding the technical phases of brownfields redevelopment while providing guidance and support through communal plans and actions. She strives to dedicate her environmental knowledge and passion to assisting communities, organizations, and individuals in successfully remediating and redeveloping their brownfield sites. Elise holds a BS in both environmental science and philosophy. So, without further ado, let's get started. Samantha, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Fatima. And a big thank you to the TAB team for having me here today. Thanks to those of you who answered the poll. It looks like a few of you are familiar with Sustainable Jersey, but for those of you who are not, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the program, and feel free to reach out to me with any other questions you have after the webinar. Happy to help. Next slide, please. So, Sustainable Jersey is a nonprofit organization that's administered by the Sustainability Institute at the College of New Jersey. We provide tools, training, financial incentives, and technical assistance to support communities as they pursue sustainability programs. In October of 2014, Sustainable Jersey for Schools was launched in partnership with the New Jersey School Boards Association and other statewide educational organizations to create a program to certify public schools. So if you are from a municipality and you haven't thought about working with your schools before, there's a lot of great opportunities for collaboration and a separate recognition program for public schools K-12 in New Jersey. So take a look at that site as well. We provide grants and technical assistance to municipalities and schools throughout New Jersey, and to date, we've distributed over $8.1 million in grants to communities to help support their sustainability initiatives and complete actions in the certification programs. Next slide, please. So, this is just a quick overview of the participation statistics for municipalities in New Jersey. So, the program started back in 2009, and we currently have 83% of the municipalities participating, which encompasses about 91% of the state's population. There's 207 municipalities that are certified now, either at the bronze or silver level. And we have 7 gold stars that have been awarded. I'll talk about that a little bit shortly. And then collectively, there have been a little over 16,700 actions that have been implemented by communities across the state. Next slide, please. So, what are the requirements to earn certification and recognition in the Sustainable Jersey program? So, there are 2 levels of certification, bronze and silver. For bronze certification, you need to accumulate at least 150 points. You need to be approved for the mandatory green team action. You need to complete 2 priority actions and then complete actions in 6 categories. For silver certification, you need at least 350 points. Um, also, to establish the mandatory green team, implement 3 priority actions, and then complete actions in at least 8 categories. Once a municipality is certified, that certification is good for 3 years. So, any municipalities that receive certification in 2024, that will be valid until the end of 2027, but they'll need to reapply in 2027 in order to avoid a lapse in their certification status. So, in addition to the 2 certification levels, we also award gold stars for reaching high levels of achievement in key dimensions of sustainability. Currently, we have gold star standards in energy, health, and water. And if you're interested in learning more about that, it's posted on our website as well. Next slide, please. So, what are some of those actions that contribute toward earning the certification? So there's over 145 different actions that municipalities can choose from. This picture is just a screenshot of just one page of our Sustainable Jersey brochure, which lists all of our actions in the program. So there's actions in a variety of categories, brownfields being one of those categories. So it essentially serves as a menu for municipalities and schools in the respective schools program to select the actions that either they have done or they might like to do in the future. So it's kind of like a roadmap or a planning tool for municipalities. And a lot of times it depends on what the municipality might be focused on. Some are more focused on energy, some are more focused on brownfields, some are more focused on waste. But as part of earning the certification, you do have to diversify and earn approval for actions in enough categories, either 6 or 8, depending on the level you're going for, just to show that you're interacting with different areas of the program. And all of our actions are kind of based on what we see as 3 pillars of sustainability: people, planet, and prosperity. All of the actions come with a fully resourced toolkit. So when you open up an action on the website, you're going to get a description that includes what the action is about, who should be involved in doing it, how to go about completing it, importantly, what to submit in order to earn points for the action. We have resources and spotlights in there. So we really try to provide as much information as we can to communities that would like to take on these different types of initiatives. And all of the actions are developed by task forces that are made up of New Jersey state local officials, nonprofit groups, and members of the business community. And those actions are vetted by local government officials to make sure that they are actions that would be doable by municipalities in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick map showing the municipalities that are currently certified and approved for any one of the 4 brownfield actions that you can earn credit for in the Sustainable Jersey program. That includes brownfields inventory and prioritization, brownfields reuse planning, brownfields marketing, and brownfield assessment and investigation. And the TAB team will be diving more into this a little bit. So stay tuned. Next slide, please. So, what does the certification process look like? So, if you're not familiar with Sustainable Jersey, the first thing that your municipality will need to do is pass a resolution and register to join the program if it's not already participating. You can find out if your town's already participating on our participating municipalities and approved actions page. After that, you want to form the mandatory green team. This can consist of municipal staff and officials, volunteers, members of different organizations in your community, school officials. Um, it's really a team to work on the different initiatives and also help with completing the documentation necessary for the certification application. Many municipalities already have an environmental commission, and there are a number of municipalities that choose to designate their environmental commission to serve as a green team. So, if your municipality is limited in its capacity, and wants to have a green team, you could certainly set it up in that way. The next thing you need to do is make sure that you meet the criteria for bronze or silver certification, which involves uploading the required documentation into your online application and submitting that for review. So what does a certification timeline generally look like? So there's 3 rounds of submission and review. The first deadline is in February, the second is in May, and the final deadline is in July. Municipalities can submit for the first time in any of the 3 rounds, but we do encourage towns to submit in the first or second. That way they can get feedback on their application prior to the deadline. So after each submission, we go through a review period, provide the feedback to municipalities, and then there's another opportunity to submit. Same thing happens for the second round before the final deadline in July. All municipalities that earn certification in a given year are recognized for that certification during our annual luncheon. That's during the New Jersey League of Municipalities conference in November, which is always really an exciting time. There's a lot of communities that come. Teams are really excited about their certification, and it is a lot of hard work. And so it's just kind of a great way to recognize that achievement and meet other like minded towns and people at the luncheon. Next slide, please. So, what are some of the benefits to moving forward with certification in the Sustainable Jersey program? So, municipalities can certainly save money and also get money through the program. There's a lot of the energy actions that tie into incentives that are offered by the state. So there's ways for municipalities to save money that way. If you implement different types of waste and recycling practices, that can also help save costs for residents and the town. And then we also offer our Sustainable Jersey Grants program to municipalities that are registered with the program. We typically have an annual cycle for that. So those opportunities are available as well. You can gain access to tools, training, and expert guidance. All of the information about our actions and our recorded webinars are posted publicly on our website, so you can access that information at any time. But we do try to hold webinars on a regular basis on a number of different topics or opportunities. And we have all of that information posted on the resources page of our website. Once you get certified, you gain recognition through the program and you can promote your town's initiatives further. So, when you do get certified, you get a custom Sustainable Jersey logo that you can use on different promotional material. And sometimes there's a friendly competition between neighboring towns to see who can get the most points. So, it's a great way to kind of highlight all of the great things that your municipality is doing. And then lastly, you can help conserve valuable resources and protect the environment. Um, residents increasingly want to live in communities that are doing their part towards the environment. And so, with the widespread of different types of actions in the program, it's a great way for municipalities to tackle a number of different issues that may be important to their community. Next slide. So, how can you potentially get involved? So, one of those ways is through our regional hubs. If there happens to be a hub in your region, there are 10 hubs around the state that help to build green team capacity through training, best practices, resources, and networking. A lot of times they hold quarterly events, or the Tri County Sustainability Hub, which consists of Burlington, Camden, and Gloucester. They have sort of annual programming that they run, that's pretty much open to anyone to participate, and we post that information on the events page of our website. It's a great way to share ideas, resources. If you have a project idea or want to get help from someone who might have done something you're thinking about doing, the hub platforms are a great way to do that. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick overview of how you can use the participants map to see who's been approved for different actions. This is how I generated that graphic of the municipalities that are approved for the brownfield actions. So you can search by action. So once you select your action or actions you'd like to view, it'll open up a list view, and you can select the municipality, and then you can click to view their certification report, and you'll be able to see the documentation that they submitted in order to earn approval for that action. Next slide, please. And then just lastly, we do have a number of events and technical assistance opportunities on our website. So I would encourage you to check them out. Our annual luncheon is coming up in November, so that'll be a great opportunity to meet other, like I said, like-minded individuals involved in sustainable Jersey. And next slide, please. And yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me today, and happy to answer questions at the end.
Alrighty, I guess thanks a lot, Samantha. And I'll come in. I'm Joe. And before we hop into the nitty gritty, I'll just go through an agenda here. I figure we'll start with the basics, what a brownfield is. I'll go through the Sustainable Jersey Brownfield actions, then provide a very high level overview of the brownfield redevelopment process. Then I'll discuss a bit about the brownfield grants and the offerings this year. At that point, I'll bounce it over to my colleague Elise, and she'll go over some grant writing tips and common mistakes. So that said, let's hop into it. Next slide, please. All right, so let's start at the ground level. What is a brownfield? Before I read this, I want to say there are many brownfield sites in the United States. That's certainly true in New Jersey. And there are many different types of sites that could be considered brownfields. And so given that understanding, how do we really define what they are? We might know one when we see it in the wild. Some brownfield sites are easy to identify. They've got an abandoned factory or a closed gas station on them, but some are just vacant tracts of land. So it's important to understand that brownfields are not just contaminated sites. A personal mantra we have here at NJIT is that not all contaminated sites are brownfields, and not all brownfields are contaminated. So what does that mean? An active gas station, for instance, it might experience a leaking gas tank that's contaminating the property, but it's not a brownfield because there's an active business. A property containing something like a closed dry cleaning facility or a closed auto shop would be considered a brownfield because it's a former commercial site that's currently vacant, and there might be contamination because of its past use, but without investigation, we can't tell, so it might not necessarily be contaminated. This is the EPA's definition used in the federal brownfield program, which is real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And anyone familiar with the Garden State should know that we do things a little bit differently here, and this certainly applies to brownfields and contaminated site regulations, where New Jersey's definition narrows the designation down to include only commercial or industrial sites, meaning vacant residential properties that may be contaminated are excluded and not considered brownfield sites per the New Jersey state government. I just have some images here of some typical brownfield sites that you might encounter throughout the state. Next slide, please. All right, so the Sustainable Jersey Brownfield Actions. So there's information that you would provide to assess points on a number of the Sustainable Jersey actions that would also serve as information that you could then use to fill out an EPA Brownfields grant application. And in that same sense, there are eligible planning and assessment activities under an EPA grant that would help you fulfill the requirements to receive points on the Sustainable Jersey action items. So there's a synergy to this. For example, you might do inventory work and be given points for that under Sustainable Jersey. That inventory can then turn around and serve as an inventory that you would use in your EPA Brownfields grant application. Under assessment grants, inventory and prioritization are eligible activities. So you could use money from the EPA grant to obtain certain actions under Sustainable Jersey. And so the inventory component of this action requires that a municipality compile a list of brownfield sites obtained through publicly available information and research. The municipality can earn additional points if they also develop a prioritized list of sites with a minimum of 3 sites. There's also brownfields reuse planning. And the purpose of this action is to proactively support collaborative stakeholder process and facilitate the identification of proposed reuse options for brownfield sites that result in enhanced livability, prosperity, and social equity. So activities related to this might include things like community engagement related to the identification of reuse options for sites, or properly dated planning or marketing documents, both of which are eligible under EPA Brownfields grant activities. We also have brownfields marketing. The goal of this action is to encourage municipalities to proactively market available brownfield sites to ultimately attract investment that leads to redevelopment. For points under this action, the municipality must compile comprehensive information about the sites. And finally, we have brownfields assessment and investigation. This action recognizes municipalities that have taken steps to assess and investigate properties with suspected or actual contamination to position them for remediation, cleanup, and redevelopment. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the brownfield redevelopment process. This can be represented through 4 discrete phases. There's planning, there's assessment or investigating or testing, there's remediation or cleanup, and finally, we have redevelopment. So we like to use some version of this tomato crop metaphor because successful brownfield redevelopment ensures certain processes are happening from the beginning and throughout to nurture your project. And that's very similar to how a crop needs sunlight, water, and nutrients its entire life from seed to harvest. Next slide, please. And just keeping in with New Jersey doing stuff differently, we have our own set of regulations regarding contaminated site investigation and cleanup that correlate to the 4 phases of brownfield redevelopment that I just went over. So something like retaining an environmental professional, that's an LSRP here in New Jersey, is a planning consideration. A preliminary assessment and site investigation, roughly equivalent to a phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessment, and a remedial investigation are components of site assessment. Remedial action work plans, the remediation or site cleanup itself, and the issuance of a document called the response action outcome that memorializes the site has been successfully cleaned up are parts of the remediation phase. So this more nuanced approach to site work is based on New Jersey's unique industrial history, our population density, and our modern real estate market. This process is triggered by a law we have here in the state called ISRA, the Industrial Site Recovery Act. And this is triggered anytime industrial and certain types of commercial properties are sold in the state. At any length, the New Jersey regulatory process is designed to ready these sites for beneficial reuse, which is the main goal of brownfield redevelopment. Next slide, please. All right, and so these are the EPA Brownfields grants. Collectively, they're called MARC grants, and there are 4 types of EPA Brownfield grants. The Brownfields Multi-Purpose Grant provides funding to conduct a range of planning, assessment, and cleanup activities at one or more brownfield sites in the target area. There's Brownfield Assessment Grants that'll cover activities like making brownfield inventories, planning for brownfield redevelopment, environmental assessments, and community outreach. There's the Brownfields Revolving Loan Fund, which provides funding for entities to capitalize loans that are used to clean up brownfields. And finally, we have the Brownfields Cleanup Grant. And this is money to carry out cleanup activities at brownfield sites. Today, we'll be discussing the last three, or the ARC grants, ARC, which are being offered by the EPA for fiscal year 2025. The EPA solicits these grants on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So who's eligible for EPA Brownfield grants? Pretty simple. You're eligible for an EPA Brownfield grant if you are a state, regional or county or local government, if you are a representative of a tribal nation, or if you are a nonprofit organization. So individuals, for-profit organizations, pass-through entities like certain LLCs are not eligible for this money. Next slide, please. All right, and here's just a table that shows the offerings that the EPA has made available this year, and as well as the projected number of awards they're offering to help address the different stages of the brownfield redevelopment process. And you see here, there's a few options for brownfields assessment grants, the revolving loan fund, and the brownfields cleanup grant at 3 separate award levels, up to $4 million. It's my understanding, as I said, that the EPA typically rotates which years the revolving loan fund is offered and which years the multi-purpose grant is offered. So some years we have MAC grants. This year is an ARC grant year. And there's a lot of numbers here, there's a lot of money here. The main thing to note is that this really is an unprecedented amount of money that's been committed to brownfields redevelopment. And the EPA is able to do this because of the passing of 2021's bipartisan infrastructure law. And it's our current understanding that these amounts have been committed for this and the next cycle, so fiscal year 2025 and FY26, which is great news if you're in this webinar and you're not ready to apply this year. It should be a total of 217 awards, totaling $232 million total across all of the grants. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, the EPA solicits these on an annual basis. And so the typical solicitation cycle will start with the request for applications, or RFA, being released in early fall. I believe it was like September 1st or August 30th this year. The application submission date is approximately 6 weeks after the RFA is released. This year it's on November 14th. Then the EPA announces the successful applicants the following spring. And finally, the funding becomes available to grantees in late summer. So it's a timeline of roughly 1 year we're looking at from the initial RFA to the final step of grant funds being available. And then just kind of cover what we'll go over next. We're going to briefly go over the different EPA Brownfield grant types that are available this year. So we'll go a bit more in depth based on that table we just looked at. And for this webinar, we are going to spend the bulk of the time going over tips and tricks for the application itself. So we really recommend familiarizing yourself with these grants by reading the guidelines in detail and referring to some existing EPA webinar recordings. Next slide, please. Okay, so Brownfields assessment grants. Got two kinds that we're going to talk about here, community-wide and coalition. So Brownfields community-wide assessment grants are offered up to $500,000 with a 4-year performance period, meaning you have 4 years to spend that money down. But if you're a state or a tribe and you're applying, then the funding is jacked up to $2 million with a 5-year performance period. And as community-wide implies, you'll be looking at several sites within your inventoried area to perform assessments at. These would be your preliminary assessments and site investigations I mentioned earlier, and your remedial investigation. You could also allocate funding to site reuse planning, stuff like market studies and revitalization plans. And in that same sense, the Brownfields Coalition Assessment Grant covers the same direct cost as the community-wide assessment does. However, the coalition grant provides up to 1.2 million in funding over a 4-year performance. And as coalition implies, a coalition of entities collectively apply for this assessment grant. There's one lead entity, and then there can be several non-lead members of the coalition that act as partners in redevelopment. And this sort of makes sense for smaller entities that don't individually have the resources or capacity to apply for and manage a full EPA Brownfields grant. Next slide, please. We also have the Brownfields RLF and cleanup grants. And you see that the revolving loan fund and cleanup grants cover the same direct costs, so I just bundled them together on this slide. The Brownfields RLF grant provides funding of up to $1 million to a grant recipient to capitalize a revolving loan fund program. And so an RLF program provides loans and subgrants to eligible entities to carry out cleanup activities at brownfield sites. So this is dependent on the entity being able to manage that process. For example, the city of Louisville, Kentucky has a successful RLF program that's seen over $3 million loaned or subgranted to entities in the state over the past decade or so. And the eligible activities under an RLF are those related to your site cleanup and any sort of programmatic management of the grant, any required performance monitoring, cleanup oversight, as well as environmental insurance. And last, but definitely not least, we have the Brownfields Cleanup Grant. And it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. The eligible activities under this are the same ones related to cleanup that the RLF covers. These grants are offered up to a whopping $4 million in funding for a 4-year performance period. That's a lot of money. Next slide, please. All right, and so if you're applying for these, you should be aware that you can apply for multiple grant awards through multiple applications. The EPA has gone ahead and prepared this nifty little table matrix for applicants to make themselves aware of which combinations of grants you'd be able to apply for. I'm not going to read off the whole thing, just leave it up for a few seconds for us to look at. Okay, next slide, please. And the good people at the EPA have also gone through the trouble to create this second nifty little matrix for existing Brownfields grant recipients looking to apply for additional funding for the same or a different grant. You can see that in some cases, there's a threshold amount of the previous grant you would have to spend down before being eligible for another one. For example, if your organization had a community-wide assessment grant, you need to spend 70% of that before you'd be eligible to receive another community-wide assessment grant, which makes sense. Next slide, please. The EPA typically includes a few updates and changes in each New Year's Brownfields grant application, and this year's no different with the ARC grant offerings. There are many updates, but summarized below are the very important ones that we decided to include. I'll just go through them quickly. Disadvantaged communities now also include communities in a United States territory. So it's Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands in Region 2, which is our EPA region. In New Jersey, this change isn't as significant for us, but it does have some implications, as I said, with PR and the Virgin Islands being in Region 2. EPA has also updated their definition of environmental justice and has clarified that the use of geographic preference to evaluate bids or proposals will no longer be prohibited. So if you have a site in Camden for say, let's say you in the past would not be able to write in your RFQs and RFPs that you are only looking for South Jersey contractors, that would be considered limiting competition. So that they're removing that sort of barrier this year so you can work with the local or regional contractors you want to work with. Applicants may now include a map of their target area and or priority sites. This is another one too. The EPA may reimburse, might give you reimbursements for pre-award costs for eligible activities in your proposed project. Stuff like travel expenses associated with brownfields related training, that's an eligible expense. The budget or project period start date has to be before the date that any proposed pre-award costs are incurred. And they also want to see that your organization will be able to effectively manage the grant should you receive it. That's this section 4AI, organizational capacity. And lastly, they've defined a small community as having a population of 15,000 or less. So these are all good things to keep in mind as being different from FY24's offering. Next slide, please. All right, SAM.gov entity registration checklist. So before we can go and apply for these funds, we do that on grants.gov, which is where we actually apply for them. We need to go through a process to prove to the federal government that our organization actually exists. And here's what it looks like when you get started registering your organization in SAM.gov. SAM, or the System for Award Management, is a critical tool for anyone involved in federal procurement and contracting. So before you sit down to register at it, just take a look at this checklist here on the left and gather all the stuff you would need for this. It's a lot. For example, you're not just putting your address in, you would need certain documents that provide bona fide proof that's your address. It might take you a little bit to gather all this stuff. You don't want to be scrambling to do this on the day it's due. So you probably should have completed this already if you're going for an EPA Brownfields grant this year. But if you didn't, I would get a move on that ASAP, like after this webinar immediately. The interface will give you the option to do only a unique entity ID or UEI without registration, but you don't want to do this if you intend on applying for a grant. You need to fully register. Next slide, please. All right, and once you've registered on SAM.gov, you've obtained your UEI, you can use that information to register on grants.gov, and that's the portal that's used to find and apply for federal grants like the EPA Brownfields ARC grants. Without completing the SAM.gov registration first, as I said, you're not going to be able to successfully submit the grant application on grants.gov. And the SAM.gov registration has to be active and updated annually to remain eligible for these grants. Once your account becomes active, it might take 2 weeks, 7 to 10 business days. You'll receive a 12-digit UEI for your organization. And this is how grants.gov will identify your organization. Then the point of contact manages the online account, manages the activities on grants.gov. You can assign different roles in SAM.gov. The person who submits the application on grants.gov is called the authorized organization representative. This is also the person that'll be informed should there be any errors in the application. You're allowed to fix the error and resubmit before the deadline, which is another reason we hope you've gotten this done early if you're going for ARC grants this year. And I realize cute puppy photos or not, this might seem like a lot to consider, maybe a lot of hoops to jump through to even be considered for this funding. And it's true, it is a lot, but it's worth the effort. And to hammer this point home, I decided to include some photos of successful brownfield redevelopments in my hometown of Patterson. I never imagined I'd ever see so-called blighted properties like the old Allied textile plant or Hinchcliffe Stadium brought back to life. Yet over the last couple of years, thanks in part to EPA Brownfield's grant funding, both of these sites have been reactivated and are serving greatly needed beneficial community uses. Next slide, please. All right, and so that about covers the basics, a tiny bit more. Here's a list of some linked resources to aid you a bit further with background surrounding the EPA Brownfields grants being offered this year. These slides will be made available after the webinar, so you'll have this reference to look at, stuff like FAQs and webinar presentations. And that about wraps up my part. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand it off to my colleague, Elise. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Fatima, Samantha, and Joe for the fantastic introductions, as well as the really useful information. To reintroduce myself, my name is Elise Moeller. I'm a Brownfield Redevelopment Specialist with NJIT TAB. And I'm going to be going over mainly the grant writing tips, common mistakes, some tricks to help kind of gather your grant application together and all the information that you need. So I'm going to say this a few times, but As Joe set the stage for the fiscal year 25 EPA Brownfield grants, I did want to remind everyone that just one of the services that we can provide here at NJIT TAB is reviewing your grant application before you submit it. We have a lot of experience and have reviewed hundreds of these, so over time we've been able to develop some tips to share as well as catalog some common pitfalls that we do see. I'm going to go more into depth on those. Next slide, please. So I want to show you where you can find these guidelines as well as the FAQ document that the EPA puts together. There's going to be FAQs for your upcoming grant applications. And these are really good resources for you while you're putting together this application. So the EPA puts a lot of time into these and they really try to capture a lot of the information. So our number one piece of advice here, and I'll probably say this a couple times during the webinar, is read the guidelines. The link on the right will bring you to the open solicitations for FY25 ARC grants webpage where you can view the guidelines for the grant that you'll be applying for. Next slide, please. Excuse me. This is an example of what the table of contents is going to look for the application guidelines, and there's a lot of pieces to put together, but what you should focus much of your efforts on is section 4, which tells you what to put in your narrative. For all the EPA Brownfield grants, the narrative ranking criteria is broken down to 4 major sections. That's going to be your project area description and plans for revitalization. Section 2, community need and community engagement. Section 3, task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. And section 4 includes programmatic capability and past performance. So these sections are essentially the essay contest sections where you make your case for community need and then you highlight community involvement. Sections 3 and 4 of the application narrative are more pro forma in nature. Think of this really as the spirit of what the EPA is looking for, but the evaluation criteria in section 5, which is also highlighted in red, is what the EPA reviewers will have in front of them when they're scoring your application, so you'll want to pay attention to that when you're writing and reviewing your own work. Wouldn't hurt to have it up as well. Next slide, please. Again, number one piece of advice is to follow the directions, which are your application guidelines. Read through them again. A happy reviewer can mean a happy outcome, and going off the guidelines and getting creative with your application can lead to some frustration during the review. Second, it's very important to tell your story. Decide what that story is, how your community is different from other applicants, and how your project is different. Ordinary doesn't get funded. And also, make sure that your project outcomes match your community needs, keeping that narrative consistent throughout each section and criteria of the application. This is a very common mistake that we see made by many grant applicants. The needs don't really match the redevelopment plans. You don't want to say that your community needs more green space and then your project is proposing housing. Next slide, please. All right, so let's look at the guidelines themselves and the individual pieces that you need to put and pull together. Section 3B, highlighted on the table of contents here, is the threshold criteria. This is pass or fail, meaning if you don't pass one of these 15 things that they're asking for here, your application will not move on to the next step in the review process. So you really want to pay attention to this criteria and make sure that you're addressing everything that the EPA is asking for. You want to make sure, for example, your project is eligible, that you have an existing grant that you've expanded it to the level that they're requiring. If you've performed the environmental site assessment work that's required for cleanup grant applications, have you complied with the EPA's requirements if you've already brought a contractor on board, and so many more. So you want to address every single instruction and guideline in your application. If it doesn't apply to you, just say that, but do not skip it or leave it blank. Just an example of kind of skipping past information, we worked with a nonprofit organization in a rural area who did not receive a grant award for FY24. When they were going over their application with the EPA reviewer, the reviewer said that they had skipped over some requirements, which was data like asthma rates, childhood cancer rates. And the nonprofit representative had said that, we barely have developers in this town, let alone someone coming in, going door to door and collecting data from, neighborhoods, hospitals, urgent cares. This is extremely valid. Sometimes your community just doesn't have the capacity or requested data. But if that's the case, you still need to mention that. In this nonprofit's case, they should have stated that there's no such data for their community instead of passing or skipping past the criteria. Next slide, please. Storytelling is a very critical part of the grant application process, and I love talking about this kind of stuff. I do dive deeper into this topic in our less than 10-minute how-to video linked at the top right of the screen. If you want to learn which ingredients are necessary to telling your specific brownfield story, how to transform your narrative into a compelling story that makes your grant application stand out more among others, I recommend checking out the video when you get a chance. In the video, I go over a storytelling example involving the Endicott Johnson Corporation and its sisters factories, Century and Sunrise, that are located in Johnson City, New York. The bottom line is that when you're telling your story and your narrative, you're putting the project into context of what it means to the community, not just in conceptual design, but also what that physical structure can represent. For the Endicott Johnson example, I could have easily just said, we have a vacant former industrial site. It has all of these environmental problems that were addressed, and then it was redeveloped into apartments. When you talk about your community, when you talk about your site, start off by saying once upon a time, and think about what that building or what that physical structure once was. In this example here, we have sister factories whose occupying company, Endicott Johnson, was really progressive for its time. They took care of their employees and their families, and then they used their land to provide recreation space for the community. After the industry moved out of the area, the building sat vacant for a long time before going in through the brownfield redevelopment process, and they were transformed into affordable housing, again becoming a community asset for the working class, and it brought the story full circle. Next slide, please. So, with the narrative ranking criteria in section 4E, this is really the meat of your application. When we were talking about storytelling, this is where it happens. It's broken into 4 sections, or four criteria as they refer to it, which is what I mentioned before. And we're going to go through all of these and give little tips and common mistakes as well. Next slide, please. So your first criterion is the project area description and plans for revitalization. Here, you're going to introduce the reviewer to your community and what's going on, what the challenges are, and what do you hope to achieve. You're going to define your geographic boundaries, which is going to be something like either your municipality or county. We always stumble over that word. The EPA used to refer to this as your jurisdiction. You want to make sure that your geographic boundary is as large as reasonable because it's going to define the project area for your grant. So let's say you decide to do a brownfield inventory and you realize some brownfields land outside that geographic boundary. You're not going to be able to include that in your scope of work. So the bottom line here is to allow yourself some breathing room. Your target area is a specific area within your geographic boundary, such as your neighborhood, improvement districts, industrial district, corridor, waterfront area, community gateway. Those are just some examples. Make sure to define the target area, and I'm talking get specific. You need to say that it's bound by such and such street to the west, Filler Avenue to the north, Passaic River to the east, and Choo Choo Railway to the south. You're going to quantify all possible brownfields within the target area and then describe your priority sites. Why those sites? What's around them? Are there schools, playgrounds, vulnerable populations? What are the impacts to them? And what criteria did you use to identify them? Next slide, please. Now, for that section that we just went over, there are some common mistakes that grant applicants will make and that we do see. I also want to emphasize again that NJIT TAB does grant application reviews and critiques for free, and if you have any questions or want us to go more in depth on what I'm going into here, you can always give us a shout via phone, email. It doesn't really have to be a one-off thing where we review your grant and send it back. If you have questions along the way of the process or different questions, we're here to help. So for section 1, applicant doesn't describe geographic area or target area boundaries adequately. As I mentioned before, you need to be specific with roads, rivers, railroads, whatever you can do to make the reviewer completely familiar with the area that you're talking about. Remember that it's likely that your reviewer has never stepped foot in the community that you're talking about. So be as specific as possible. Paint that picture. The applicant confuses geographic area with target area. Just describe the differences between that. Applicant doesn't provide details of priority sites, structures, slab. Is it secured? Are there wetlands? Is it overgrown? Is there known contamination? The applicant doesn't select priority brownfield sites that best make the application case. You want to grab sites that have data associated with them that shows these areas in the worst light possible. I know when we talk about our communities, we really want to highlight the best parts of them, but with grant applications, we want to focus on the worst. Applicant lists too many priority sites. You don't really want to list more than 3 or 4, then it becomes too much. It's it's quality over quantity. The applicant doesn't describe what process will be employed to identify and prioritize additional sites to expend funding on. So let's say you have some priority sites, but issues arise. Maybe you can't get access to the sites or something, and then you have to start looking at other sites. You want to make sure that you have a process in place that explains how those new sites will be identified. Applicant doesn't discuss who will actually do the prioritization. For this, you just want to make sure that you have a core group, whether that's your Brownfields task force, that will be a part of this process. It can also be community members. Some people live across the street from an abandoned gas station and they have to look at it every day. So these people will know a lot of information about these sites. Next slide, please. Continuing on with the same first criteria, applicant doesn't discuss how identified plans specifically pertain to priority brownfield sites or target area. You want to make sure that the plans you include relate to your application. Applicant doesn't discuss other plans that are relevant. That's just kind of leaving out plans that are relevant. And for this, you can think of a bigger scope. Are there any transportation projects that are scheduled to occur that may impact access to your site? This would be, also help define a potential reuse for that site. The applicant confuses outputs with outcomes. Outcomes and benefits are things like more acres of open space, creation of new jobs, population boosts. And an output would be 4 phase 1 environmental site assessments and 3 phase 2s. Applicants don't delineate between potential future resources and secured resources. Applicant doesn't relate funding resources to appropriate phase. This really goes back to having a solid planning effort, solid blueprint for your project. Sometimes funding resources are only available at certain times of the year or only available for specific stages of the redevelopment process. Applicant forgets to mention infrastructure that provides access to the site, or applicant forgets to mention required infrastructure upgrades. Next slide, please. So criterion 2 is community need and community engagement. This is a pretty data-heavy section, so you're really weaving the data into a story to further illustrate community attributes. Why the community needs this funding? Why can't the city just pay for the project? Keep it cohesive. You want to establish that there's financial and socioeconomic barriers and burdens in the community, threats to sensitive populations, who these sensitive populations are, and what are the social, environmental, and health data, as well as economic data, that show these indicators and tell the story of the challenges that are facing the community. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into all of these, but these are just several sources of data that you should consider to identify and support your target area. These slides will be sent out, so I'm not going to go through every single one, but we can go on to the next slide, please. And on this slide, I provided you with a list of some data sources along with the URLs, so you do have a good place to start. One thing I do want to note while you're gathering your data, just kind of make sure that you're checking and sourcing data from multiple places, multiple websites, sources, rather than just one. Next slide, please. So for criterion 2 that we just discussed, some common pitfalls that we see are the applicant forgets to mention burdens to entities' budget that prohibit funding the project. That can be climate change events like hurricanes, flooding, policing vacant sites that have illicit activities that have a strain on the budget. So what burdens does a community have to endure that really puts a pressure on the budgets that you can't fund the project on your own and you need EPA funding? The applicant doesn't quantify statements regarding health and census data. Again, can't just state that your community has high rate of heart disease or cancer. You have to justify it with factual data. Applicants forget to discuss exposure pathways related to priority sites. You want to make sure that you have a good connection between brownfield contaminants and exposure of individuals in your community. Joe actually had a really good webinar, shout out Joe, on this from early 2024 that discusses common brownfield contaminants and exposure pathways. I do recommend checking it out on our website. And then applicant forgets how many times they'll forget to kind of mention how this project will remedy those threats and EJ issues that you just mentioned. So make sure that's covered. Next slide, please. Continuing on, applicants make mistake of going for quantity versus quality of partners. You don't need to fill the page with 8 partners. While all 8 of them are doing community engagement, you really want to diversify those roles. The next bullet, applicants tend to have redundant roles, goes back to what I said. And then applicants discuss community input as a necessary requirement instead of meaningful, and how garnered input will be considered in the project. This is really important. Community engagement is super important to the entire process. It should be done early, it should be done often, and should be done meaningfully. You don't want to do it just to check off a box and say that you did it as per the requirements. It should be vital and a critical part of the process. Next slide, please. So here's a hypothetical example of what not to say, specifically for section 2. According to the CGES tool, this is a disadvantaged community. The vulnerable populations are impacted by the brownfields in the neighborhood. This grant will be used to clean up the site to create a memory care clinic for elderly veterans. The neighborhood is also impacted by flooding. So with this, what data shows that this is a disadvantaged community, and compared to what? How are the brownfields impacting your elderly veterans? Why will the site be transformed into this use? How will that help? There's probably many social, environmental, economic impacts that affect a disadvantaged community, so you want to consider the compounding effect. Don't just make statements, but walk the reader through what the flooding means in this context. Does it scare the business away? Does it further imperil the safety of the vulnerable populations here? The successful example that I have on the right gives the data to back that up, and bringing in climate change about how things are just going to get worse for this community, things like that, the specific impacts, it's really important. Get more specific, appeal to emotion, watch that storytelling video, how-to video that's linked before. All right, next slide, please. So criterion 3, I'm just going to go over a little blurb about it, is task descriptions, cost estimates, and measure in progress. This section's a little more straightforward. It's more pro forma, so just answer the questions. Here you want to show a generalized timeline of how the work will be done during the grant performance period. Some common pitfalls that we see: applicants include a schedule that is unrealistic and or out of sequential order for the tasks that they list in their application. Applicants confuse outputs and outcomes. Again, we already talked about this, but your outputs are going to be things like how many phase 1s and how many phase 2s you're going to do, number of brownfields on your inventory, while your outcome is the result of the project or activities. Again, acres of green space, jobs created, and so on. Applicants don't include generated accurate costs. They back into a number. Applicants don't check math. This is something that we see a lot. Double check the numbers and your math. Very common mistake. Go through it again. Applicants don't include a project tracking method beyond acres. Acres is required as part of the grants, but you also want to make sure that you have some other system employed that's going to track the progress of your project. And then applicants don't include a corrective action to be employed should the project go off track. You should come up with an effective mechanism to be able to get that project back on track should that happen, and you also want to explain what that's going to be in your application. Next slide, please. Next section, next slide. So criterion 4 is programmatic capability and past performance. Again, this section is also very pro forma. You don't really want to be creative here. You want to clearly describe your project management structure and how it will function. Use names, titles, years experience. You don't want to just say township manager. They do have a template table in the guidelines that you'll want to use if it makes sense to summarize the information in a table. Just makes it easier to read, it clears it up, takes up less room. And address all the criteria. This is where you're talking about your experience with federal or other grants. So if you don't have a history of this work, then say that. You'll get a neutral score just for answering, but if you don't answer and you leave it blank, you'll get 0 points. Many times during a debrief, the EPA will tell an organization they missed the bar by 1 or 2 points, and here is not where you can afford to leave points on the table. So some common mistakes that we see: applicants don't include a structure and description of how it will function, or applicants forget to reference in accordance with 2 CFR Part 200 or higher procurement standard. So this is how you will basically acquire additional resources. You want to make sure that you're complying with federal requirements. So you simply just need to make that statement unless you're operating in a state or municipality where that standard is actually higher than what the federal government requires. Next slide, please. Applicants forget to consider the or option. This is important. There's 3 options here. You either previously received an EPA Brownfields grant, you have not received an EPA grant but have received other federal or non-federal assistance, or you never received any type of federal or non-federal assistance. You have to follow that or option and indicate the one that applies to your set of circumstances. Applicants forget to list accomplishments and compliance. For this, don't be modest. Toot your own horn on how capable your organization is to carry out and manage this grant. Don't give more than 3 examples of past successes, and make sure that you list all your accomplishments and that you've complied with all the requirements. Applicants forget to discuss what the applied corrective measures of a project were if it went off track. Sometimes it just happens, or a project goes off schedule for some reason, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get funded. You just want to make sure that you list here what the corrective action is and that is successful, and you're eventually able to meet the requirements of the grant. Next slide, please. So, quick example, take a look at these hypothetical examples. You'll see the one on the right just looks much easier to read. It's more concise, clearly highlights the outputs and outcomes. The one on the left is kind of a jumble of words, or mess of words. Next slide, please. I know that we're over the hour. This is going to be super quick, but these are kind of just our overall general helpful tips. So read the guidelines and resource materials thoroughly. Follow the guideline outline. Don't get creative. Again, a happy reviewer might mean a happy outcome. Use tables when appropriate. It can conserve space. Don't skip questions because you don't have information or data, like that example I gave with that rural community that kind of skipped over something. Do not add hyperlinks to data or other information. The EPA reviewer cannot leave your application. So if you add hyperlinks to URLs or some kind of data, they're not going to click it. So leave that out. Get one person to edit the application. Get someone who knows nothing about the project to review your application. This is important. If that person has questions at the end of reviewing your application, so will your reviewer. And finally, if you hire a consultant, make sure they tell the story you want told. Next slide, please. All right. It's a lot of information, I know. These slides will be shared with everyone, as well as the recording of this presentation. Again, my name is Elise Moeller. I'm a Brownfield Redevelopment Specialist with NJIT TAB. And Samantha, Joe, myself, and our team, we thank you guys for your time, for joining us today. And we have some time for questions and answers. I don't know if there's anything in the chat, but I know Fatim has some slides to go through as well.
Great. Thank you for presenting, Samantha, Joe, and Elise. Thank you so much for highlighting EPA Brownfield grants and how to make your application stronger as well. It's how organizations like Sustainable Jersey could potentially bring in additional funding to your projects. For attendees outside of New Jersey, it's worth looking into programs that maximize your efforts in a similar manner. If you need additional assistance, feel free to reach out. We would love to connect with you after today to see how we can assist you in your EPA Brownfield grantee journey. In fact, NJIT TAB can provide a multitude of services for communities in EPA Regions 2 and 4. Just so you know, if you didn't, we're EPA Region 2. We serve as a free independent resource to state, territory, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits attempting to learn about, identify, assess, clean up, and redevelop brownfields. At NJIT TAB, we help through our Brownfields Academy, Brownfields Community Engagement and Educational Forums, and one-on-one technical assistance. Along with virtual webinars such as today, NJIT TAB can assist you with other virtual or in-person Brownfield community engagement and educational forums. From beginner-friendly Brownfield basics to more hands-on technical events such as, but not limited to, panel sessions, community workshops, and Breaking Brownfields, where we invite private sector representatives and experts to answer your project-specific questions. NJIT TAB can meet you wherever you are in the Brownfields process. We also provide one-on-one technical assistance where we offer tailored guidance for many Brownfield-related tasks. You can answer any questions that you may have about your Brownfield project. If you'd like more information, we also host our Brownfields Academy on our website at www.njit.edu/tab. Here you can find a wealth of information such as how-to videos, infographics, success stories, previously recorded webinars, news, upcoming events, and more. Elise mentioned it earlier, but I'll repeat it again. Calling all communities in EPA Regions 2 and 4. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is offering an anticipated $232 million in Brownfield ARC grants this year. NJIT TAB is offering a free review of your grant application to help you submit the strongest possible version to the EPA. We'll provide detailed feedback so you can review and incorporate our suggestions before the final deadline. To do so, simply submit your application to us by October 31st for expert critique. Don't worry, I know it's Halloween, but EPA grants, not that spooky. And we'll help you out in that. Anyway, sorry, had to get on the tangent. But what you do is you'll email your application in Word format to Carrie Martin at carrie.martin@njit.edu. Final submission to the EPA is due by November 14th. So the sooner you put in the application, the sooner we could critique it, and the sooner you could get it back and submit it before the deadline. Don't miss out on this chance to secure funding for your community's brownfield redevelopment. We helped secure nearly $20 million in funding last round. Let our team assist you on the path to success. Speaking of Carrie Martin, while she's assisting communities with their brownfield projects under NJIT TAB, Carrie also heads up our NJIT TARP program. If you're a community in need of additional hazard mitigation assistance in New Jersey, NJIT and the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management created the NJIT Technical Assistance for Resiliency Program to provide New Jersey's under-resourced communities with those needed resources to increase awareness of viable mitigation strategies to develop and submit FEMA hazard mitigation assistance applications. NJIT TARP can work with you to better understand viable mitigation strategies, connect you with resources, assess your funding eligibility, and share case studies. NJIT TARP will be providing technical assistance on hazard mitigation projects in person at the NJ Association Floodplain Management Conference on October 22nd. Come with your grant application questions. The fiscal year 2024 FEMA BRIC and FMA grant guidelines are anticipated soon. NJIT TARP will be holding both in-person and virtual events in late October, early November to review the grant guidelines once they are announced. So keep an eye out for more info. Also, please reach out to Carrie Martin for more information. We also have a couple of upcoming events you may be interested in. On October 4th, we have the One Region Forward for Climate Action Symposium. Hosted by the University of Buffalo Regional Institute, this symposium will comprise of a conference from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m., followed by mobile breakout sessions in the afternoon. NJIT TAB's Environmental Sustainability Planner, Carrie Martin, will be taking part in a panel discussion on grid resilience. This panel will focus on regional best practices and future-looking considerations for Buffalo Niagara. Carol will be offering her perspective on sitting renewable energy on brownfield sites in the Buffalo Niagara region. She'll also be available in the afternoon to meet with attendees to provide one-on-one or small group technical assistance related to climate-smart brownfield redevelopment. On October 16th, the EPA is hosting the Region 2 Brownfields Program FY25 Guidelines Overview Workshop. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Region 2 Brownfields Program invites you to participate in their upcoming FY25 New Guidelines Workshop in Trenton, New Jersey. Here they'll cover types of EPA brownfield grants, application requirements, overview of ranking criteria, and additional resources available to applicants. NJIT TAB will also do a presentation on how we can assist during this process via technical assistance and grant critiques, such as how I explained before. If you're not local to New Jersey, keep listening. There will be another workshop in New York, as well as a virtual session in October as well. On October 17th, there will be a Breaking Brownfields in Stony Point, New York. In partnership with Urban Land Institute, join NJIT TAB's Director of Environmental Services, Kaylin Bruno, for one of our most dynamic sessions, Breaking Brownfields. In this interactive forum, you'll have a chance to present your specific brownfield redevelopment challenge to a panel of private sector experts who then provide actionable feedback on overcoming those obstacles. If you've hit a brownfield redevelopment roadblock, now is the chance to get instant feedback and advice. We also could host a Breaking Brownfields in your community. Reach out and let's see what we could do. Again, as mentioned before, October 22nd through the 24th is the New Jersey Association for Floodplain Management Annual Conference. As part of the NJIT TARP program, Carrie Martin will be attending this year's New Jersey Association for Floodplain Management Annual Conference. This conference is the premier floodplain management conference in the Northeast. With over 500 attendees, this conference provides an opportunity for professionals in the fields of engineering, hydrology, geology, planning, code enforcement, floodplain management, and emergency management to participate in educational seminars, training opportunities, and exclusive networking events. On October 24th, as I mentioned before, for New Jersey, the EPA Region 2 Brownfields program will have their FY25 Guidelines Overview Workshop in Albany, New York. And lastly, on October 29th, they'll be having their virtual session. For those who aren't, my apologies. Yes, so if you're not local to New Jersey and New York, feel free to attend this session. For those that can't make it to our events or like to access this webinar after today, we post recordings along with presentations and related resources and links on our website at www.njit.edu/tab/webinars. Today, we've highlighted 3 for you that might complement your brownfield journey. Feel free to view those recordings after today's webinar or explore the NJIT TAB website to find a vast library of resources, links, and other informative videos. So if you have questions after today, feel free to reach out. That's totally fine. We also do have the after webinar survey. You're free to put in any questions there as well. Don't worry about it. Totally fine. We also have our Zoom scheduler link. Those of you who don't know, there's a faster and simpler way to contact us if you want to just set up a Zoom meeting. There's no back and forth on when are you available, when are you available. We post our schedule. Mimi just posted the link. Just click that link, see a time that works for you, and you've immediately scheduled a Zoom meeting. So we want to just remove some of those barriers to get people to talk to us. If you need support, we're here for you. All right, well, if we don't have any questions, with that, we thank you for spending some time with us today. We hope this webinar series has empowered you to confidently navigate the murky waters of EPA Brownfield grants, and that you were able to find a tropical island of additional funding through Sustainable Jersey's Actions Program. When it comes to additional funding, you don't want to become 2 ships passing in the night. Happy sailing, everyone, and we'll see you next time.